In Genesis chapter 19, we have really the continuation of what we talked about last week. You remember that we talked about the Lord coming to Abraham and saying that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And the two men that are with the Lord, the two angels that are with him, leave and they start going towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And they arrive in Sodom in chapter 19, and that's where we pick up. Chapter 19, starting in verse 1. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And he said, Now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house, and spend the night, and wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way. They said, however, No, but we shall spend the night in the square. Yet he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So the first thing that we want to note in this set of verses is Lot's hospitality. That the angels come to Sodom and Lot sees them. He's sitting in the gate. And it's actually a similar to what we read in chapter 18. Well, Abraham is sitting at his tent, and he sees three men far off, and he runs to them and he says, Let me serve you, let me give you a feast and give you a place to stay and help you along the way. And in the same way, Lot does the same thing here. He rises up to meet them, bows before them, and offers them great hospitality. Now, we do want to note the angel's response. The angels reply that they're going to stay the night in the square. I don't know if that was really the custom at the time for travelers, if they just stayed in the open square. And another thing about this is I don't really know why the angels would say this, knowing Lot and knowing who he is and knowing their mission, I guess you could call it. Why they say to him, No, but we will stay in the open square. It's not really told to us why. But Lot, however, insists that they stay with him. And certainly he wants to be hospitable, and we will talk later about the importance of hospitality in this Near Eastern culture. But also, I would wager that he probably knows the nature of the men of this city. So let's keep reading in chapter 19, starting in verse 4. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have relations with them. But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, Please, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Now behold, I have two daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you, and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, Stand aside. Furthermore, they said, This one came in as an alien, and already he is acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them. So they pressed hard against Lot and came near to break the door. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. They struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. I find a few things interesting from the description of the men of the city. First of all, something that you might not think about, but I thought about as I was studying, there's absolutely no mention of alcohol at all in the text. Now, that doesn't mean that it was present or was not present. But it also could mean that they were totally sober and their inhibitions totally intact, which would be amazing to me, even more amazing than if they were drunk and doing these things that they were doing. But something that we do see in the text that is made very clear in the text is that this was not just a few troublemakers in the city, but rather a large portion of the population. It says that it was both young and old. It says all the people from every quarter. When the word all is used there, that doesn't suggest just a few troublemakers, but rather most, if not all, of the people, the men, both young and old, in the city. All the people from every part of the city are here, and they are the ones requesting this thing from Lot. Not really requesting, but demanding this thing from Lot. And thirdly, another thing that I notice about the men of the city is that they surrounded the house. From the beginning, the intent was to take Lot's guests by force. There was no, let's talk this out and see how it goes. It's, give them to us or we're going to use force. That was the nature of the thing that they were trying to do from the beginning. And their intentions are clearly stated. They, like brute beasts, saw the men who were staying with Lot and intended to have relations with them. But I'm also puzzled by Lot's reaction. Lot begs the men not to harm his guests, but rather he offers his daughters to the men. And this offends our sensibilities, as it absolutely should. But we also need to understand why he would do this. In ancient Near Eastern tradition, it was very important to treat visitors well. How visitors under your care were treated reflected upon you and even your city. And so why Lot is protecting these men is very well understood. He needed to protect these men to protect his own reputation. And if we're playing the advocate for Lot here, perhaps he knew the nature of these men. Perhaps he knew that they would refuse that offer, and perhaps he thought they would leave after that. But whatever the case, Lot should not have compromised himself or his family while protecting these men. He absolutely should have protected these two men, as he knows the men, but we know them as angels. He should have protected them, but not compromise his family in the process. And we note the men's determination. The men are so wicked that they're not going to take no for an answer. They pressed against the door. They intended to force their way into Lot's house. If they had had their way, they would have used whatever violence necessary to accomplish their desires. However, the angels, of course, strike the men with blindness. They're not able to see or coordinate what they're doing, and they're left grasping for the door, unable to find it. Continue reading with me in verse 12. Then the two men said to Lot, "Whom else have you here? A son-in-law, and your sons, and your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he hesitated. So the men seized his hand and the hand of his wife and the hands of his two daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him. And they brought him out and put him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, or do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains, or you will be swept away." But Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Now, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Now, behold, this town is near enough to flee to, and it is small. Please let me escape there. Is it not small, that my life may be saved?" He said to him, Behold, I grant you this request also, not to overthrow the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore the name of the town was called Zoar. Excuse me. We want to note throughout this passage the angel's urgency, that they are urging Lot to get whomever he has and take them, get out of the city immediately. They know the destruction of Sodom is imminent, and they want Lot to be as far away as he can get. But you contrast their urgency with the lack of urgency from Lot and his family. He goes and warns his sons-in-law, and they think that he's jesting. And then he inexplicably waits until morning to gather his wife and his children. Morning comes, his wife and his children are there, and the angels have to urge him and say, Get out! Escape! And then even then he hesitates, and the angels have to practically drag Lot out of Sodom, and his wife and daughters as well, out of the city. And they tell Lot and his family to run away, to not stay in the valley, and to not look back at the city. They needed to make a straight line from Sodom to wherever they were going. They said the mountains. Lot barters with them and gets to go to the small town of Zoar. And so he's supposed to go there, and they're supposed to make haste. They're supposed to not turn back. But of course, that doesn't quite happen the way that it's planned. Continue reading with me in verse 23. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife, from behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now Abraham arose early in the morning, and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the valley, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace. Thus it came about, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot lived. One thing that we want to notice here is the terror of the Lord. Can you imagine such a scene as what is depicted here? I want you to put yourself in the shoes of one of the people living here. One day you're going about your life, and the next, brimstone and fire are raining down on your city with no warning to that happening. And then we have this little moment mentioned of Abraham, that he looks down and he sees Sodom and Gomorrah. And I did some digging to find the distance between Hebron and Sodom, and I wasn't able to find exact numbers on that. Maybe because we don't know exactly where Sodom was. But based on estimates of where people think Sodom was, and based on my own calculations, Abraham was about 30 miles away from Sodom, and even further from Gomorrah. And yet he sees the smoke of these cities coming up like the smoke of a furnace. The magnitude of this event is incredible. And it would have been absolutely terrifying to be a part of. It would have been terrifying to even be Lot and his wife and his daughters running away from this. Imagine the heat, imagine the sounds, imagine the smells of this terror. And of course, we have Lot's wife. Remember, the angel said not to look back. We don't know why they said this, but they did. And Lot's wife did look back, and she became a pillar of salt. Some translations I believe it was Natalie's translation noted that this may be a figure of speech, but there's really nothing in the text that indicates that this is not literal, that she did not literally become a pillar of salt. And I read some articles about, scientific explanations for this. Whatever the case is, she became destroyed because she looked back. And really it shows a problem that all of Lot's family had, that they had become too attached to this wicked city. I think Lot's wife looked back because that's where her heart was. That's where she wanted to be. Even though it had all that wickedness, even though it was being destroyed, that's where her heart was, and that's where she looked. And that was her downfall. But even in all this destruction, even in the destruction of Lot's wife, we also see God's faithfulness. Side by side with all this destruction, in this passage, we also see God's grace and God's loving kindness. Lot's family has not made this easy on the angels who have been charged with getting them out of Sodom. They've practically resisted them at every turn. But it said that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. God's grace and God's loving kindness saves Lot and his 2 daughters. Keep reading with me in verse 30. Lot went up from Zoar and stayed in the mountains, and his 2 daughters with him. For he was afraid to stay in Zoar, and he stayed in the cave, he and his 2 daughters. Then the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with their father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. On the following day the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. As for the younger, she bore a son and called his name Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. The way that this chapter ends is not pretty or satisfying or a happy ending by any means. It seems that Lot's daughters believed that the entire earth was destroyed. And again, hearkening back to the terror that I talked about, if you think the whole earth had been destroyed because of what you heard and what you smelled and maybe what you saw, that's saying something. But they apparently think this, and they look to procreate, and really it's genuinely difficult to commentate on this section. But once again, I think that it shows the consequences of living among wicked people like they had, to think like this and not have faith in God like they should, and really just misunderstand the whole situation. But one insight that we do get from this is that this is where 2 of the nations who neighbor Israel, this is where they come from. Moab and Ammon are born because of these acts. And what this means for the audience that is reading it, remember that this is Moses who writes Genesis, and he's writing to the children of Israel who are about to come in and take over the land and inhabit the land. And one of the nations that they need to throw out, well, both of those nations that they need to throw out, Moab and Ammon, among others. So it means that they were relatives of the children of Israel, and that would have added significance to the children of Israel as they were coming into the land. You see those nations that you need to take out? This is where they come from. Genesis 19 is a difficult chapter to read. It's one of the most difficult chapters in the entire Bible to stomach. But I want to leave you with these thoughts. Turn with me over to Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11, and look at verse 22. Paul writing here says, "Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity. But to you, God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will be cut off." Now Paul is talking to Jewish Christians, and he's talking about the fate of Israel. And the idea that he's getting across to these Romans is that the Jews who rejected God were not going to continue on. They were not going to be part of the promise. And so that is where the severity of God comes in. They were punished. They were cut off from the branch of Israel. And other people, some Jewish Christians, some Gentile Christians, were made the new branch, spiritual Israel. But when we talk about this verse, given what we just talked about, I think in Genesis chapter 19, we see the kindness and the severity of God side by side. His kindness is shown in his remembrance of Abraham and his saving Lot and his daughters from Sodom and Gomorrah, showing that he is indeed unwilling to sweep up the righteous with the wicked, as Abraham questioned whether he was willing to do. And God lived up to his promises to Abraham. He went into the city. He didn't find 10 righteous in the city. But he did save those who were righteous. At least Lot, we know, was righteous, and his family with him. But we also see the severity of God in Genesis chapter 19. With the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities going up in ash and smoke suddenly without warning. We see his severity in Lot's wife, that she disobeyed the angels and became a pillar of salt. And so side by side we see that picture of God so often that we see throughout Scriptures, that yes, God is a God of loving kindness and graciousness, and that he forgives iniquity. But he by no means spares those who do evil. That is the duality of the nature of God, that he is loving kindness, has loving kindness and graciousness. But he's also going to visit wrath upon the wicked. But I also want to consider God's kindness and severity as it pertains to us. Whether you realize it or not, every single one of us in this auditorium have experienced God's kindness. That we have been allowed to continue on this earth, though we have all sinned against the Lord, is a kindness of God. It is his forbearance. And then, as I'm speaking to mostly Christians this evening, you've experienced God's kindness, and that you have accepted the grace that he has freely given to you, and you have become set free from your sins. Paul told these Christians that they should continue in God's kindness. And I say the same to you. You should continue in God's kindness. But then we look upon those who were cut off. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Jews that Paul was speaking about in Romans 11. And many others. And we should be reminded of God's severity. That God does not leave the wicked unpunished. And so I leave you to contemplate the kindness and severity of God tonight as you stand with it. Only you know 100% between you and God where you stand. And you need to know where you stand. And know that you can make the choice to see the kindness of God, or you can see the severity of God. What will your choice be this evening? If you're not a Christian, please choose the kindness of God. Accept the Lord's gospel, believing in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, repenting of your sins, confessing Him before men, and being baptized for the remission of sins. Obey the gospel and see and taste that the Lord is good. If you are a Christian and perhaps you've turned away, again, the choice is yours this evening. If you need to make things right before the Lord, won't you come while we stand and sing?